Okay, so tell me a little bit about your background and how you got involved in the disability community and like FEMA in general.
Okay, so my background has always been in support of or an ally of individuals with disabilities. I started working with United Cerebral Palsy in the Oregon Southwest Washington chapter. And then I worked in Colorado for a bit for Self-Determination Resources Incorporated. And then probably the biggest changing aspect for me in my career and kind of that jump to emergency management or inclusive emergency management was a position that I took within the Oregon Office on Disability and Health. And that's in Portland, Oregon, under Oregon Health Sciences University. And through that position, I did a number of projects, but it was shortly after Hurricane Katrina. And we received grant funding from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the National Center on Birth Defects, Disability and Development to take a closer look at accessibility within emergency management and how we're working with individuals with disabilities, cross disabilities, to inform emergency management, preparedness, and what that looks like. So that was a big kickoff to my career. And then shortly, or my career within emergency management. And then shortly after that, I wouldn't say shortly, but around 2013, I was approached with this position, which was a newer position within FEMA as a regional disability integration specialist. And at that point, there were 10 of us within our respective regions. And so I applied for that position. And I think at that point, a lot of this discussion was not necessarily new, but it was somewhat new to FEMA. And some of those approaches, working with individuals, stakeholders, having individuals with disabilities at the table, and how we can use that information to inform our operations and so forth. So that was kind of a pivotal moment. I think Hurricane Katrina really kicked off that position, but then it also kind of developed the work that I did within Oregon and then transferred over to FEMA, which is the Federal Emergency Management Agency.
Cool. So like, what's your role at FEMA? You're like an disability integration specialist, is that correct?
Yeah. So my role within FEMA, so I work just specifically for Region 10, and Region 10 is Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and Alaska. And my title is a Regional Disability Integration Specialist. There are 10 of us who work, so what we refer to as steady state. So blue skies, no disasters, just planning, that type of thing. And then we have another role where we deploy to disasters or emergency situations. And so my role in a steady state is a couple of things. Primarily, I would say I get to engage and work with individuals with a lived experience of disability. I get to work with agencies, organizations, cross-disability agencies and organizations. Within each of our states, we have disability advisory groups, which are pretty prominent in kind of helping emergency management to identify where accessibility needs to be integrated, kind of outside of box thinking, that type of thing, to enhance emergency plans. So that's kind of a big piece of it, is that stakeholder engagement. Internally, it is working with FEMA staff to implement policy that comes from our headquarters around disability access inclusion, providing education, awareness, reviewing plans, that type of thing. So FEMA is pretty complicated. I'm one little role within a big agency. Yeah, and so and then another role of that is to deploy. So when we have disasters, so we have a lot of floods, wildland fires, everybody's aware that earthquakes are probably our biggest concern here in Region 10. So if that happens and it reaches the level of a federal declaration, then my position is activated. And so I would initially sit in a regional kind of a regional emergency operations center. We call that the RRCC. And then in support of we're always in support of the state. And so and really looking at our programs and services and how we reach communities and to make sure that they're receiving services from FEMA in an equitable way.
Yeah, that's great. So like, what kinds of things do you do to help people with disabilities, you know, to like be prepared for like a natural disaster, or, you know, be more independent in that type of, you know, be more independent in general is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. When people, I always, there's a framework that a lot of folks use out there, and we refer to this framework as CMIST. So CMIST. So the C stands for communication, M stands for maintaining health, I is independence, the S is safety and self-determination, and the T is for transportation. So what I do when folks come to me, ask me questions, ask to review plans, or maybe, within a disaster, we're trying to reach specific populations with our messaging or whatever that may be, I apply that framework. And so if you think about communication, you think about, are things written in plain language? Is it accessible to people who are deaf and hard of hearing? Is it presented in formats that may be Braille or electronic, that folks can use their assistive technologies? When we think about independence, are we thinking, maybe there is a FEMA housing mission, right? So there could be a disaster and FEMA is providing, housing assistance or rental assistance, or sometimes there's manufactured housing units. What we always think about is we want to know what that person's living experience was before, and we want to make sure that is maintained in their temporary, next step of their recovery. So do they have the equipment that they need, medications, maybe it's a personal care assistant, whatever that may be, those supports are kind of wraparound services so that individual can remain independent in their own home. And then, the safety, self-determination, we want folks to drive the process, right? Individuals with disabilities know best. They navigate this world every single day. And so they need to direct us and tell us what works best for them. And so a big piece of my role is to kind of open up those chains of communication within emergency management. So folks do have that voice at the table and can direct their own recovery. And then things such as transportation, right? Not everybody drives. Some folks rely on the city bus. Some people use paratransit. Some people use a bike. Some people don't have transportation at all. So they may be very dependent on somebody else to get them from point A to point B. And so we need to think about all of those things, and how we provide our services, whether that's in a response, whether it's at the local level and they're thinking about evacuation, whether we're thinking about sheltering and what that looks like. And then, a big piece of FEMA is that recovery. So how do we get folks through that recovery process to get back to kind of what it almost looked like pre-disaster?
Yeah, that's great. How are you guys involved in the community? Any stakeholders that you partner with closely in your efforts?
Absolutely. I think I cannot do this job without without disability stakeholders. And we have so Region 10, again, like I said, is Oregon, Alaska, Idaho, and Washington. And within each of those states, we have what we refer to kind of in a FEMA framework is a core advisory group. But each of these groups are driven by individuals with disabilities, with a lived experience, represent cross disability, have representatives from, legal, self-advocacy, you know, emergency management, that type of thing. And so in the state of Washington, we have the Coalition on Inclusive Emergency Planning. In Alaska, we have the Alaska Disability Advisory Group. In Idaho, we have the Idaho Inclusive Emergency Coalition. And then in Oregon, we have the Oregon Disability Emergency Management Advisory Council. So those are groups that typically meet monthly. They're working to support their local, state planning, preparedness, planning, whatever that may be regarding emergency management, to ensure that emergency management is talking to individuals with disabilities, because we know that's the best way to ensure our plans are more accessible and reaching the population that we need to reach. So this work cannot be done without stakeholders. It cannot.
Yeah. So like, how would you tackle the stigma of disability from your perspective as an organization?
I think, what I want FEMA and kind of, what FEMA is doing right now, I think FEMA is in a really great place. We are actively embracing within our strategic mission equity. And a big piece of that equity strategic plan is leading people first, right? So how do we bring individuals with the lived experience to inform our processes? And I feel the more that our FEMA staff, programs, services, and just emergency management as a whole, the more engagement, direct engagement that they have with individuals with disabilities, that starts to break down those barriers, the stigma, the biases, those type of things that kind of stop us from doing what we should be doing. So, that's one strategy, is to really bring those perspectives, those voices, and start to kind of build that capability of our disability stakeholders and emergency management both, because we're oftentimes speaking different languages. So on both sides, we need to have that capability and be at the table.
Yeah, that's really important.